There is a feeling most men carry but rarely name. It sits somewhere between confusion and frustration, a quiet sense that something, somewhere, shifted, that the patterns they once understood, the instincts they once trusted, no longer produce the results they used to. And what makes it unsettling is not the confusion itself. It's the fact that no one seems able to explain where it came from. You weren't told when the rules changed. You weren't handed a new framework. You were simply left to navigate a system that evolved quietly underneath you, and then blamed yourself when your footing felt uncertain. That's what we're going to talk about today. Not surface level advice, not tactics or scripts or techniques. Something deeper, something more foundational. Because once you understand what actually changed, not just what feels different, but why, everything else starts to reorganize itself into clarity. And when that clarity arrives, it doesn't feel like a revelation. It feels like finally seeing something that was always there. So let's begin at the beginning, not with behavior, with environment. The modern environment is not neutral. This is the single most important thing to understand, and almost no one says it clearly enough. The environment you are operating in, the social world you move through every single day, has been fundamentally restructured, and restructured environments produce restructured behavior. That is not an opinion. That is how systems work. For the majority of human history, social interaction was bounded. It was local. Your immediate community was your universe. The people you could meet, the relationships you could form, the impressions you could make, all of it was constrained by geography, by proximity, by the very real limits of physical space. And within those constraints, behavior developed its own internal logic. There were signals, and those signals meant something. There were expressions of interest, and those expressions were grounded in reality. There was a certain predictability to how people evaluated each other, because the reference point for evaluation was shared and finite. Then the environment changed, and it changed faster than psychology could adapt. Digital platforms didn't just give people new tools for communication. They rewrote the fundamental architecture of social reality. Visibility is no longer local. It is global, instant, and scalable. Attention is no longer something you earn within your immediate world. It can arrive from thousands of people who have never met you, will never meet you, and are responding to a filtered, curated projection of who you might be. And this shift in the scale and structure of social visibility changed everything downstream. What you're observing in the behavior of women today is not randomness, it is not irrationality, it is not malice, it is adaptation. It is perfectly logical behavior responding to a perfectly new set of environmental conditions. And once you see it that way, the confusion begins to dissolve. One of the most powerful forces reshaping perception in this new environment is what happens when options appear unlimited. Note the word appear, not when options are unlimited, when they appear to be. Because perception and reality are two very different things. But psychology responds to perception. The brain does not always distinguish between what is real and what feels real. And in a digital environment, where a woman's phone can contain dozens of unread messages, where attention arrives from sources she has never interacted with in 3 dimensions, where algorithms surface curated images of idealized lives and filtered versions of desirable people, The felt sense of available options expands dramatically, even if the actual options are not as extraordinary as they appear. And when the perceived field of options expands, the internal reference point shifts. The standard against which any given person is measured, consciously or not, recalibrates upward, not because anyone made a deliberate decision to raise their standards, but because the brain, operating within a new environment, is quietly updating its baseline based on the signals it's being fed. This is not a character flaw. This is cognition responding to stimulation. It happens to everyone. The difference is that in the modern environment, women receive a far more constant, far more intense stream of this type of stimulation than at any previous point in human history. And so, the calibration shifts in ways that are subtle, persistent, and largely invisible, even to the person experiencing it. What this means for you, practically, is this. The woman you are interacting with is not evaluating you in a vacuum. She is evaluating you against a felt sense of what else might be available, a sense that may be distorted by digital environments in ways she is not consciously aware of. This is not about blame. It's about understanding the system. Now we need to talk about attention, because attention, in the modern world, has become something entirely different from what it used to be. Attention used to be simple. It was a social signal. It meant, I see you, I am here, I am interested. And because it was bounded by physical proximity, it carried genuine weight. You couldn't receive unlimited attention. You had to earn it. And once you had it, it meant something. That is no longer the world we live in. In a digital environment, attention is transactional. It arrives in the form of likes, messages, views, reactions, comments, follows, each one a small unit of social currency. And when attention arrives constantly, when it is quantified and visible, when it functions as a measurable indicator of perceived value, it stops being a neutral signal and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a feedback loop. Here is how that loop operates. Attention, even superficial attention, increases the felt sense of personal value. An elevated felt sense of value naturally adjusts expectations, what feels like an appropriate return on one's own social currency. Those adjusted expectations then shape selection behavior, and selection behavior, in turn, either attracts more attention or signals selectivity, which often attracts even more attention. The loop is self-reinforcing, and most people living inside it have no idea it's running. What this means is that a woman navigating the modern social environment is not making purely conscious, deliberate decisions about who she finds interesting or who she gives her time to. She is, in part, operating within a reward architecture that has been quietly shaping her internal economy of attention in ways she likely cannot articulate. And you, on the receiving end of that dynamic, experience the outputs without understanding the mechanism behind them. This is why interactions can feel inconsistent, not because the person is inconsistent, but because the system producing the behavior is more complex than the behavior itself suggests. Let's go deeper. Because beneath the mechanics of attention and options, there is a psychological shift that is subtler and more consequential. In a natural bounded social environment, evaluation tends to be present-focused. You encounter someone. You experience who they are in real time. You form an impression based on direct interaction. The assessment is grounded in what is actually there. In a digital environment, something changes. Evaluation becomes comparative rather than present-focused. Instead of asking, "Is this person interesting to me?" the question, often unconscious, becomes, "How does this person compare to what else I've been exposed to?" And what people have been exposed to is a curated, filtered, algorithmically selected highlight reel of human possibility. Real people, interacting in real time, inevitably suffer in that comparison, not because they are less valuable, but because they are unfiltered, unpredictable, and three-dimensional in a world that has trained perception to favor two-dimensional perfection. There is also a shift from presence to projection. When you are constantly exposed to the projected versions of others, carefully constructed, strategically presented, you begin to evaluate real people, not for who they are, but for what they project. The surface becomes the signal. The performance becomes the data point. Depth, which takes time and presence to perceive, is systematically underweighted. And then there is perhaps the most significant shift of all, from connection to optimization. In a world of perceived abundance, connection is no longer the primary frame. Optimization is. The question stops being, "Is there something real here?" and starts being, "Is this the best possible allocation of my time and attention?" This is not a conscious calculation most people would endorse if asked, but it is the logic the environment produces. Understand this, and you understand a great deal about why modern social dynamics feel the way they feel. Now here is where most men make the critical error. And it's not the error you think. When interactions feel unpredictable, when signals seem inconsistent, when effort doesn't produce the results logic suggests it should, the default interpretation is personal. It must be me. Something about who I am, how I look, what I said, how I presented myself. And from that interpretation flows a predictable response. Try harder, optimize more, seek feedback, adjust the approach, and try again. But this interpretation, while emotionally understandable, misdiagnoses the situation completely. Because the problem is not that you are doing the wrong thing within the correct system. The problem is that you are applying the logic of one system to the reality of another. Imagine trying to navigate a city using a map from 20 years ago. The roads look similar. Many of the landmarks are still there, but the infrastructure has changed. New routes, closed streets, redirected flows. You follow the map precisely and still end up somewhere you didn't intend. And if you keep concluding the problem is your driving, you will never think to question the map. The map is the old model of how social dynamics work. The city is the new environment, and the confusion you feel is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is the predictable output of a mismatch between a model and the reality it's supposed to describe. This realization changes everything. Because once you stop treating every outcome as personal evidence about your worth, you free up enormous cognitive resources to do something far more useful. Understand the actual system you're operating in. So what does understanding the system actually look like in practice? It begins with a shift in the questions you ask. Most people, when confused by an outcome, ask, quote 4 or quote 5. These are reactive questions. They keep you inside the loop of trying to optimize your behavior within a system you don't fully understand. The questions that generate clarity are different. They are, what environment is this behavior responding to? And what incentives are structuring this person's experience? These are systemic questions. They lift you out of the personal frame and into the analytical one. And from that vantage point, the behavior that once seemed confusing begins to reveal its internal logic. A woman who seems inconsistent in her attention is not being irrational. She is operating within an environment that has trained her attention to be distributed widely and emotionally non-committal. Because distributed, non-committal attention is the optimal strategy for maintaining optionality in a world of perceived abundance. That is a rational response to her environment. It just feels personal on the receiving end. A woman who seems to lose interest after initial strong interest is not being manipulative. She is living inside a feedback loop where novelty has been elevated, where comparison is constant, where any given person must compete, consciously or not, against a continuous stream of new stimulation. The interest was real, but the environment has trained her novelty detection systems to deprioritize the familiar. When you see these dynamics for what they are, systemic adaptations rather than personal judgments, something remarkable happens. The emotional charge dissipates. The confusion resolves. You stop reacting. You start observing. And observation without reaction is where genuine understanding lives. Let's talk about signals. Because in the modern environment, the distortion of signals is one of the least discussed and most consequential dynamics you need to understand. In a natural social environment, signals are constrained. They are bounded by context. They carry meaning because they are costly to produce, because expressing genuine interest, making real effort, showing up consistently, these things require something real. They are not cheap. And because they are not cheap, they are reliable. When someone signals interest with their actual presence and time and attention, that signal means something. In a digital environment, signals are radically cheaper. Interest can be simulated with a message sent in 30 seconds. Connection can be mimicked through the appearance of intimacy created by carefully chosen words in a medium that strips away body language, tone, and the full dimensionality of human presence. Intentions can be masked indefinitely behind the curated projection of who someone wants to appear to be. This creates what you might call a signal pollution problem. The environment is saturated with signals that look like meaningful indicators, but carry far less information than they appear to. And when signal quality degrades, interpretation becomes unreliable. What feels like genuine connection might be the product of digital chemistry that evaporates the moment physical reality is introduced. What looks like disinterest might be attention deficit produced by overstimulation rather than genuine evaluation. What seems like inconsistency might be the logical output of an environment in which consistency is not rewarded. You cannot navigate this environment accurately if you are reading its signals the way you would read signals in a simpler, less saturated world. The cognitive tools you brought to this situation were built for a different kind of signal. Learning to recalibrate, to assign appropriate weight to the signals you receive, to distinguish noise from information is one of the most practically valuable things you can develop. And here is where detachment becomes not just a coping mechanism, but an analytical tool. Most people understand detachment as something you deploy when you've been hurt, a way of protecting yourself from the emotional weight of outcomes you don't control. And there is truth in that. But that's a narrow understanding. The deeper function of detachment is cognitive. When you are emotionally invested, in the outcome of an interaction, your perception of that interaction narrows. You begin to see what you want to see or what you fear to see rather than what is actually there. Confirmation bias accelerates. Pattern recognition degrades. The more you need a particular outcome, the less clearly you can see the actual dynamics producing it. Detachment from outcomes creates perceptual space, and in that space, patterns become visible that were invisible before. You start to notice the timing of when someone responds, the consistency between what they say and what they do, the delta between how they engage when you are present and how they engage when you are not. The way certain behaviors repeat across different people in similar situations, which tells you the behavior is less about you and more about the system. This is not cynicism. Cynicism is a form of emotional reactivity. It just runs in the direction of bitterness rather than hope. Detachment is something different. It is calm, clear-eyed observation, without the distortion produced by wanting a particular answer. And it is surprisingly rare. Most people oscillate between hope and hurt without ever settling into the still point where real patterns become visible. The still point is where clarity lives. One of the most important distinctions you can make in this environment is between what is real and what is digital, and not in a crude, dismissive way, in a precise, analytical way. Digital attention and real attraction are not the same thing. Digital attention is cheap, fast, and scalable. It can be given to hundreds of people simultaneously with minimal effort. It can simulate depth without containing any. It can feel intimate while being essentially anonymous. Real attraction, the kind that is grounded in physical presence, in chemistry, in the full dimensional experience of another person, is costly, specific, and rare. Confusing the two leads to consistent misreading of where you actually stand with someone. Visibility and connection are not the same thing. You can be highly visible in someone's digital life, constant contact, frequent response, emotional availability, and still be functionally absent from their actual world. Visibility without presence is a hollow approximation of intimacy. And yet, the digital environment trains people to experience visibility as connection, to assign meaning to contact that the contact does not actually contain. Access and genuine interest are not the same thing. In a world of abundant access, access itself becomes cheap. Having access to someone, being able to message them, being responded to, being in their orbit, no longer carries the weight it once did. Genuine interest is rarer, quieter, and shows up in different signals than access. It shows up in consistency over time, in initiative, in the willingness to be present in the three-dimensional world, rather than just the digital one. When you can reliably distinguish between these things, not with bitterness, but with clarity, you become far less susceptible to the mirages the modern environment produces with such relentless efficiency. None of this, by the way, is about assigning blame. This is a point worth making clearly because it's easy for analysis of this kind to slip into something else, into resentment or generalization, or a way of distancing yourself from genuine connection under the guise of intelligence. The environment shapes everyone inside it. Women are not uniquely culpable for adapting to the incentives the digital world creates. Men are not victims of some coordinated campaign. Everyone is navigating a system that evolved faster than human psychology, producing behaviors that often don't serve anyone's deepest interests, while feeling locally rational to each person performing them. Understanding this, genuinely understanding it, not as a rhetorical concession, but as a factual recognition, is what separates analytical clarity from cynicism. Cynicism says, this is what people are like. Clarity says, this is what this environment produces. The difference matters enormously, because cynicism closes down possibility while clarity opens it up. When you understand behavior as environmentally produced rather than essentially personal, you retain the ability to recognize genuine exceptions, to notice when someone is operating outside the typical patterns, to distinguish between behavior that reflects the environment and behavior that reflects character. And that distinction is ultimately what allows you to find something real in a world that has become very good at simulating it. So what does it look like in practice to move through this environment from a position of clarity rather than confusion? It looks like this. You stop over-indexing on early signals. You understand that early interest, whether it feels intense or cool, is operating within the distorted atmosphere of the modern environment. It tells you less than you think. What tells you more is consistency over time, behavior under inconvenience. What someone does when maintaining contact costs something rather than when it costs nothing. You stop interpreting silence or inconsistency as primarily personal. You understand that in an environment of fractured attention and competing stimulation, inconsistency is often the baseline, not a judgment about you specifically. You read patterns, not individual moments. You stop seeking validation from sources that are fundamentally unstable. Social media response, message frequency, the volume of attention someone gives you in a digital space, these are noisy signals produced by a noisy system. They are not reliable indicators of how you are valued in someone's actual world. Building your sense of your own worth on these metrics is building on sand, and you start applying your attention and energy with greater precision. You invest in the signals that carry real information, physical presence, initiative, the willingness to move toward you in the three-dimensional world, rather than simply maintaining a digital connection that is convenient and low cost. You act with intention rather than reaction. You observe without immediately interpreting. You hold outcomes lightly, not because you don't care, but because caring without attachment is the state from which the clearest decisions are made. There is something worth saying about what this understanding produces in you over time. When you first grasp these dynamics, when the system becomes legible and behavior stops feeling random, there can be a temptation to feel above it, to feel that seeing the mechanism makes you immune to it. But that's not quite right. Seeing the mechanism doesn't eliminate your participation in it. You are inside the same environment. Your perception has also been shaped by it in ways you may not fully see. The work of clarity is ongoing, not achieved. What does change, genuinely and durably, is your orientation toward confusion. Before understanding, confusion felt like a judgment, like evidence that something was wrong with you, or wrong with others, or wrong with the possibility of genuine connection. After understanding, confusion feels like an invitation, like a signal that there is a dynamic here you haven't fully mapped yet. And that signal is interesting rather than threatening. That shift from confusion as indictment to confusion as information is quieter than it sounds, but more significant. than almost anything else, because it means you are no longer at the mercy of outcomes you don't understand. You are engaged in a process of understanding that continues to deepen, to refine, to reveal more of the structure beneath the surface. You become, in short, someone who can see. And in an environment that runs on distortion, the ability to see clearly is one of the rarest and most valuable things you can possess. Here is the principle that ties all of this together, stated as plainly as I can state it. Clarity does not come from trying to control people. It does not come from optimizing your approach, or reading the right books, or following the right formula, or making yourself more desirable in the ways the market currently rewards. All of those things are operating inside the system. None of them require you to understand it. Clarity comes from understanding systems, from stepping back far enough to see the environment for what it is. Not what you wish it were, not what it used to be, not what it might become. What it actually is right now, with all of its distortions and incentives and adaptations intact. And when you see it clearly, when you understand that behavior reflects environment, that confusion reflects mismatched models, that signals are degraded but not meaningless, something shifts. Not in the world, in you, right? You stop seeking explanations from outcomes. You stop needing other people's behavior to be legible in order to feel grounded. You stop waiting for the confusion to resolve from the outside. Because you understand that clarity is something you generate internally by continuing to refine your understanding of what you're actually operating within. What once felt personal reveals itself as pattern. What once felt random reveals itself as logic. What once felt like rejection reveals itself as the predictable output of an environment that is simply doing what environments do, shaping the behavior of everyone living inside it. And from that position, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Not control, not immunity, but genuine understanding. And genuine understanding in a world this noisy and distorted and fast is a rare and quiet kind of power. That's what changes when you finally understand this. Everything already makes sense. You just needed the right lens to see it.